Hello, and I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to talk about an emotion today that I've been feeling a fair amount recently, which is sadness, which I think is sort of the most important emotion to talk about because it's one that drives so many of our behaviors. To flee sadness is the impulse at the root of so many of our behaviors. And I want to talk about the gift and the tenderness of sadness and my personal process for facing sadness and moving through it, or rather letting it move through me. The first thing I want to say about this emotion, and I think I've alluded to this or laid this out even in other videos or writing, is that sadness is kind of the deepest emotion. Perhaps the second deepest, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the Buddhists famously laid this out in the notion life is suffering, right? That this is this essential dynamic or plane in existence. I want to talk briefly about how other emotions can show up, again, as attempts to flee or as distractions from sadness. So, anxiety, for instance, which is really kind of a heightened or mentalized fear, is about a potential loss in the future that we want to avert through the anxiety, right? There's this excitement. How do I get away from, negate this loss? How do I get out from under it so that it doesn't happen? If the loss occurs, we'll feel sadness. So anxiety is kind of preemptive sadness and avoidance of sadness. Anger can respond to the very same circumstance as anxiety. So rather than fearing losing something, we might stand up to protect it, right? I'm going to fight against this tyrant to save my government, to use a relevant example in this moment, or going to protect my family from this virus, or whatever might call us to act in that way. And underneath this is the sadness that we would experience if we lost whatever we're protecting, whatever we're fighting for. So not feeling sadness is our reason for behaving in so many ways. I said that sadness to me is the second deepest emotion, and that's because when we move through or clear our path of suffering, of sadness, underneath we find absolute clarity and bliss. And this too, the Buddha knew. This was sort of Buddha's key discovery, that beneath the suffering of existence, which for the Buddha is created through mental projection and attachment, lies this field of absolute clarity and bliss. And I've spoken about this before in videos too. This is oneness, peace, and love. We can feel this as the essence of existence. Or to put it differently, this emotional state is the container in which something like sadness or anger or anxiety exists. It is the cup filled with these other emotional states. I wanted to lay out this architecture, and then I wanted to talk about ways to move through sadness. And first I want to I want to kind of point out what not to do. And this is a pragmatic orientation. Just to clarify, pragmatic orientation is the one not to take, paradoxically. The pragmatic orientation knows that underneath sadness lies bliss. And so if I can just move the sadness out of the way, there the bliss will be. However, attempting to rid ourselves of any emotion for an objective like this counterintuitively prevents that emotion from fully emerging and therefore prevents it from fully passing. So an example of this would be if I'm feeling sad about something, let's say I'm feeling distant from my partner in a relationship, and I journal about it, but the thrust of my journaling is persuading myself not to be sad about the situation, actually to see it in a different light. What I'm really doing is temporarily pushing the sadness out of the center of my awareness. There's a force here, and it's going to spring back, and it's going to be just as strong, if not more strong, on its second emergence. And this is the way in which emotional stagnation works, not only with sadness, but with any emotion. And it's the way addiction works. And addiction can have a myriad of objects, not just drugs or alcohol. I consider myself addicted to YouTube videos in some ways. Through addiction, we push aside that which we don't want to feel, rather than building a deeper fortitude with which to encounter it. And it springs back, and we're still the same person who still has the same faculties or lack thereof with which to face the emotion. And so again, we enter the cycle of addiction, right? And that's how that works. That having been laid out, I want to talk about the technique that I do recommend for dealing with facing sadness, and the technique that I use. And this would be the same technique for any emotion or any experience. And it's simply reverence or submission. It is, what is this experience? What is this energy here to teach me? And so sadness in particular, I experience as a very heavy energy. To use a contrastive emotion, happiness, not joy, but happiness, can feel very light and flitty. And in its toxic form, I'm even up here in my head and in my eyes and disconnected from my body, literally ungrounded in the state of ecstasy, right? We have the phrase toxic positivity to describe someone who doesn't have the capacity to hear or receive others' emotional states if they're not deemed positive, right? So in this ecstatic, exuberant, heightened state, I might push away, not have the space for my friend who's had a difficult day. And the reason for that actually is that my happiness is not stable. Deep down, there's a fear. If my friend shares this day with me, it's going to harsh my mellow, to use a funny phrase, and bring me down to where they are. So again, there's this fear of sadness. This is almost universal. And how does sadness feel? I wanted to talk about this earlier. Sadness to me is a heavy energy. It feels aqueous. It feels like we are in water. It's an immobilizing energy. It feels like there is nothing I can do to escape this condition. And that's really the extreme of depression. Sadness as depression, when it metastasizes, says this will never end. It hypothesizes about various situations, right? I can become rich, I can get, the spouse I want, I can be famous, I can, all these fantasies we might have. And it's not going to change anything. There's a sort of fatalism at the core of sadness. Again, life is suffering. Buddhism, the classic precept. I simply want to offer that submitting to this state of resignation, where I feel there is nothing I can do, this is never going to change. And I've actually been here with some frequency recently. Has to do with some elements in my personal life, has also to do with coronavirus and fatigue around screens, isolation, the way we're living. When we really submit to this feeling, go the distance. Another phrase comes to me. This is Joseph Campbell. The treasure you seek lies within the cave you fear to enter. When we really go the distance with our sadness, we reach this state of extreme tenderness, which is actually a form of fertility. So in deep sadness, we know that part of the reason I feel lonely is I am, in some sense, disconnected from others and from myself and from the world. And this is the plight of the soul in the human body or in any other vehicle. There's this memory of oneness, of togetherness, which might be accessible through peak experiences in human life, but not as a permanent state. And this memory induces this constant undercurrent of sadness. Or we might be in touch with the undercurrent of sadness that goes along with time. Time is always bringing loss. My body is decaying, is disappearing. The people that I love, the places that I love are decaying, disappearing. And as a companion to this sadness, this existential sadness, is love for those people and those things, is appreciation for them. This appreciation, this love, is inseparable from the recognition that they are transitory, that I cannot keep them forever, that in some sense, any ownership over them is an illusion. We cannot have the one without the other. And so, sadness, when deeply submitted to, when we feel the heaviness, the permanence of this sadness, it's bringing me down and I will always be here. This alone makes us alive to the realities of the world in a way that no other emotion can. These other emotions that kind of orbit sadness and seek to flee sadness. Sadness alone, in my understanding of and experience with it, provides this portal to ever-deepening truths about life and the universe, which coincide with love, with acceptance, with understanding and generosity. And so I say all of this not to, again, provide another pragmatic orientation. Face your sadness and you'll get this beautiful light, these wonderful gifts at the end of the tunnel, because it simply doesn't work that way. That's not the way the game is set up. The way to render and receive the gifts is to embrace sadness as its own entity, its own energy, its own end, not with expectations of what comes after, not with expectations of reward. think that's all I wanted to share in this video. It's a relatively small domain that I was speaking to here, just this one emotion and different ways we might behave with respect to it, and the gifts it alone can give us if we truly approach it with reverence. And I guess in closing, what I would like to offer to you as an expansive awareness is to think of what other energies in your life might function in this way. Could be emotions, could be places, could be people, could be animals. If you really bow down and isolate these things individually and sort of worship them, what happens to you and those energies in that moment? How is your consciousness, how is reality transformed? This sort of dynamic is applicable not only to sadness, but to every energy we might encounter as our teacher in this reality. So, with that, I hope you have a blessed day. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.